Good afternoon. My name is Paige Dillis, and I am a Kevin B. Harrington Student Ambassador. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for this afternoon's event. I first wanted to take a moment to point out the emergency exits located at the entrance in the back right corner and behind you all in the back left corner of the auditorium. In the case of an emergency, please exit through the closest door. Our restrooms are also located outside in the hallway to your right. The Institute's mission is to educate, engage, and empower citizens of all ages to actively participate in the civil and political life of their communities and strengthen democracy. The Institute is a nonpartisan organization and has been dedicated to promoting a healthy democracy for over 20 years. James Conroy is a Massachusetts native who is a University of Connecticut graduate and served for 6 years in the United States Naval Air Reserve. He's also earned a master's degree in international relations at George Washington University and his Juris Doctorate at the Georgetown University Law Center, all while working on Capitol Hill as a speechwriter, press secretary, and chief of staff. Conroy practiced law for 38 years and is also a co-founder of Donnelly, Conroy & Gelhar, one of the leading litigation firms in Boston. In 2014, Conroy was elected a Fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society in recognition of his first book, Our One Common Country, Abraham Lincoln and the Hampton Roads Peace Conference of 1865. Conroy published a second book entitled Lincoln's White House, The People's House in Wartime, through which he was a co-winner of the Lincoln Prize and won the Abraham Lincoln Institute's annual book award. Conroy also published Jefferson's White House, Monticello on the Potomac in 2019. We welcome him today to discuss his newest work, The Devils Will Get No Rest, FDR, Churchill, and the Plan That Won the War. The book is an account of the 1943 Casablanca Conference, where Winston Churchill, FDR, and their military chiefs planned their strategy at the turning point of the Second World War. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming James Conroy.
Thank you, Paige. I appreciate that, and it's a pleasure to be here again. This is my fourth time here. I'm not running for president, so you can run that headline. But I do appreciate the opportunity. The book is about the Casablanca Conference of January 1943, where Roosevelt and Churchill and their combined military high command met for 10 days in secret in Casablanca at the turning point of World War II, and we'll talk about that as we go. But I think as you'll find if you think it through a bit as we talk, that apart from being what I think at least is an interesting historical event, the issues and the conflicts and the negotiations and so forth that took place at this conference are in many ways a good model for problem solving between opposing parties, because in many ways, as we'll discuss, the British and the Americans were allies, but they were also opposing parties in many respects with regard to strategic thinking and national interests and political philosophies and all the rest. And miraculously enough, they were able to resolve their differences in the middle of World War II, which is good for all of us because we'd all probably be speaking German today if they hadn't. And we'll talk about that as we go. So I think the best way to start is to look at the situation that prevailed in January of 1942 when the conference took place, which, if it could be summed up in a single word, I think it would be terrifying. Starting with the Pacific Theater on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see here the Japan proper is in black, as is all of Korea, North and South Korea, and Taiwan. Japan had conquered those areas back in the beginning of the 20th century and had actually, absorbed them into Japan itself. So they had long been part of Japan. The rest of the area that you see there in gray, darker gray, had been conquered and occupied by the Japanese at the time of the conference. And as you can see, we basically have the total domination of the Western Pacific by the Empire of Japan at this time. And although the American Navy had stopped the advance of the Japanese Navy at the Battle of Midway and Coral Sea in the spring of 1942, a few months before the conference. They had sunk 3 out of the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, which really made it impossible for the Japanese to continue to expand. Their offensive ability had been snubbed, but the defensive situation that they were in at this time was really quite formidable, and it was clear to everybody that it was going to take a lot of blood and treasure to to reverse that. On the left side of the screen, we see the situation in Europe, which, if anything, is even more frightening. In the middle there, in black, you've got the Axis powers, the 2 Axis powers in Europe. The German Reich, which by that time consisted of Germany, Austria, and most of Czechoslovakia and some other German-speaking areas of Central Europe. And Italy there, of course, the boot, and Sardinia and Sicily, the 2 islands to the left of the boot. So that's the Axis powers in command of the center of Europe and the Mediterranean. Then off on both sides of them, you have in gray the countries and territory that the Axis powers in Europe had conquered and occupied as of January 1942. So you've got basically all of Western Europe with the exception of the British Isles. I skipped a step, actually. The darker gray shows the areas that had been conquered and occupied by the Germans. The lighter gray shows the supposedly or nominally neutral countries in Europe at this time, every one of which was sympathetic to the Axis powers and helping them in various ways, supplying them with iron ore and financial help and all kinds of other assistance and support. So with the exception then of the British Isles, you've got essentially all of Europe totally dominated by the Axis powers. Another very tough nut to crack. Also at this time, one more piece of prelude, if I may. The Allies, the British and the Americans, had not enjoyed a single military success, with the exception of the Battle of Britain, which was purely defensive, that the British had kept the Germans out of England, at least temporarily. But with that exception, which was a defensive victory, neither the British nor the Americans had defeated the Germans and the Italians in any battle through the middle of World War II, here in January of 1943. They'd always been on the back foot. One of the British generals described it later as hanging on by our eyelids until the Americans could ramp up and get the industrial and military power that they needed to turn all of that back. Now, what happened then in the fall of 42 in North Africa, 2 things. One, the British Army won their first battle against the Germans in Egypt at the Battle of El Alamein. And you can, maybe your guys are better than mine, you might be able to see it over on the western edge of Egypt, and had sent Rommel's Africa Corps fleeing to the west across North Africa. Within about 2 weeks or 3 weeks after that, an Anglo-American invasion force had landed in Morocco and Algeria and took all of that area from the French, who were quasi-allied with the Germans at that time, having been defeated by them in 1940. And so at that point, you've got the first Allied victories over German forces in World War II, and you've got an Allied occupation of North Africa, with the exception of Tunisia, which is in the dark gray there in the middle of North Africa. And there's a big Anglo-American army and naval force there in North Africa. And the decision now is, what do we do next? How do we go on the offensive? We've survived, at least temporarily, these first few years of World War II with nothing but defeat on the record. But now that we have won 2 major campaigns, the issue becomes, how are we going to start to roll all that back? Which is why the conference was called at the suggestion of FDR. I only recently found this. A friend sent this to me, which I would have used in the book had I had it earlier. But this shows you the vast extent of the Japanese Empire's control of the Western Pacific at the time of this conference. They had taken the Dutch East Indies from the Dutch, French Indochina from the French, Burma, Malaya, Hong Kong, and Singapore from the British. And you could actually see up to the very northeastern tip there, they had actually taken some of the Aleutian Islands, which were American territory, off Alaska. So you've got complete domination by the Empire of Japan in the Western Pacific. So here we have a photograph taken at Casablanca with FDR and Churchill, of course, in the front. And behind them are their combined chiefs of staff. On the left side behind FDR are the Americans, and on the right side behind Churchill are the British. We'll talk about each of them as we go through. It's a very character-driven book. I think that people are much more interesting than statistics, and it's easy, anybody who wants to know how many landing craft there were, or where the oil reserves were and all that sort of thing, can look that up. There's very little of that in this book. It's really the personalities and the character of the major players, how they interacted, how they got along or didn't get along, what they thought of each other. So it's really a person-based enterprise. And we'll talk about each of them a bit later as we go. But I want to make a couple of points here before we do continue. First, back in late December of 1941, just a few weeks after Pearl Harbor, by the way, the Japanese attacked British possessions on Pearl Harbor Day, as well as the Americans. Hong Kong and Singapore and various other places in the Pacific that had been under British control. So the Americans and the British were allied now, in fact, as well as in principle, in late December of 41. They met in Washington, Churchill, FDR, and the gentleman you see here on the screen, and began to work out some sort of common approach to how this war was going to be won. And one of the major things they did at that meeting was to agree on a unified command of their military senior officers, meaning that the Americans weren't going to make decisions for the Americans and the British for the British and wish each other luck. They were going to meet regularly and make joint decisions about how to use the resources, where to fight, where not to fight, and how to coordinate their activities, which became the closest alliance in military history. There never had been so close a combined military command in two major powers as there were between the Americans and the British. In those days, we need to keep in mind, second point, the much greater difference between the British and American cultures and nationalities in 1943 than there is today. It's different enough today, but back at that time, no internet, obviously, no television, no shared radio programs. They didn't read the same newspapers, didn't read the same magazines. There was no commercial air traffic between Britain and the United States to speak of, unless you were super rich and could afford a Pan Am flying boat. But that aside, there was very little contact, very distinct cultures and very distinct countries with still vivid in American minds what one junior officer wrote at the Casablanca conference. Having gotten to know the British better as he had, he realized they were not the red-coated devils that he'd been taught to despise in school. So this is a different world view than we have today, and a different relationship between these two countries. The third and last point I'll make on this photograph is the friction between those three gentlemen on the left and those three on the right. They all respected each other. With some exceptions, they liked each other, and we'll talk about the exceptions. But there was very different philosophy, very different military approach to things, very different political system. You know, the British Empire was still the dominant force behind Britain. Most, if not all, of their great wealth was based on that empire. The Americans were anti-colonial. FDR certainly was. And we could go on the rest of this 45 minutes about all of that. But the essence of it is to keep in mind that there's tension here as well as friendship. One feature of which is what George Marshall, one of the third man on the left up there, the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, later talked about what he called our freshman innocence when they were dealing with the British. The British had been a major world power for 300 years. The Americans had only begun to dabble in world affairs a few decades earlier, had nothing like the depth and the sophistication and the experience that the British had. And one element of that was a kind of imperial condescension that came floating across the conference table. British, of course, very polite, very gentlemanly, very civil, but a tangible kind of condescension that didn't make the Americans happy. At one point, a British general wrote soon after the conference that the Americans were friendliness itself, loyal, trustworthy, hardworking, and very good at organization, all of which could be said about a border collie. And that kind of subtle condescension was a point of tension and difficulty at the conference. Joseph Stalin, the dictator of Soviet Russia, was not at the conference, although the Russians were an essential ally of the Americans and the British. But Stalin was in Moscow with his high command at the time the conference was going on, waging the Battle of Stalingrad, which was the turning point battle on the Russian front. So they had their hands full and were not at the conference, although FDR and Churchill had both invited them. This, I think, is the most well-known portrait photograph of Winston Churchill, taken a few months before the conference. There's a kind of cute little story associated with that. The picture was taken in Quebec after Churchill came to the United States in early part of the American War to meet with Roosevelt and stopped in Canada on his way home. A young Canadian photographer took the portrait picture, had his tripod all set up and his camera and the rest. And Churchill, when he sat down in the chair, had a big cigar in his hand and a big smile on his face, which was not the look that the photographer wanted. So the photographer stepped around the tripod, snatched the cigar out of Churchill's hand, and came back behind the camera, and that's the look he got, which is what he was looking for. Churchill used to say he could put on his warlike face whenever he wanted. Well, that's his warlike face. The thing to know about Churchill in this context, and we don't have to belabor him much, but Churchill was steeped in military and naval affairs. He had graduated from Sandhurst, which is the British equivalent of West Point, served in the British Army in 3 wars, colonial war in Sudan, the Boer War, and the First World War, and in fact participated in the last cavalry charge in British history. So you see the scope of history that had passed from that day to this one. He had written 24 volumes of military history since 1885, and had been First Lord of the Admiralty in World War I and Secretary of State for War, also in World War I. So he was really steeped in the military end of things, military strategy, tactics, and the rest. Unlike FDR, this is a portrait photograph of Roosevelt taken soon before the conference was held. Roosevelt had never served in the military. He had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy in World War I, but had not really been involved much in the military end of things as opposed to the political end, and did not have a lot of depth or sophistication in military affairs. He had boned up certainly since 1939 when the war began, and had absorbed what he needed to absorb, but not on the same plane as Churchill. Very similar to the military guys versus, the American military guys versus the British military guys, being on the downside of the expertise, experience, sophistication level, and the same can be said of FDR. Another little vignette that I like to tell. The night before FDR left for Casablanca, which was top secret, nobody knew he was going, nobody knew it was even going to take place, FDR had a dinner party, he and Eleanor, his wife, at the White House on New Year's Eve, a few weeks before, actually about a week before he left for Casablanca, and planted a joke at that dinner party that no one would understand for a couple of weeks to come when they showed, as he often did, a private screening of a new movie that had just come out, Casablanca, with Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman. So here we have an example of FDR's sense of humor, which he was well known for. What he did have, by the way, before we go on, without this military depth that Churchill had, he had a terrific political sense. You know, it's been said that there's never been a better politician than FDR. He was terrific with people, had a natural charisma and rapport with people, and a terrific political instinct, how to handle situations, how to get people to do what he wanted them to do, and we'll see that as we go through this presentation. So now we go through the chiefs of staff. This is George C. Marshall, who was the Chief of Staff of the United States Army throughout World War II. Marshall is best known for the Marshall Plan when he was Secretary of State for President Truman in the next administration, the Marshall Plan being the plan to rebuild and recover the damage that had been done, the tremendous damage that had been done throughout the world by the war. But Marshall was a professional soldier, had risen very quickly up through the ranks of the American Army. And I always feel like a picture is worth 1,000 words when you get a good portrait of someone. And if you look at that face, I think you see the character and the stern, no-nonsense air of command that George C. Marshall exuded. A future Secretary of State, also under Truman, described his experience with Marshall as a striking and communicated force just by sitting in a room, that he took command walking into it. He would sit down and remain in command of that room until the meeting was over. And I think you can see that in those eyes and on that face. Here we have a picture of Marshall with General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was at the time a junior general, a brigadier general, and a protege of Marshall's. They're making a tour of an American base in Europe during the war. And another personality captured here, I think, Eisenhower's running for mayor, and Marshall looks like his dog just died. So you kind of get the contrast in those personalities. Eisenhower was at the Casablanca conference as well. We probably don't have time to get into that, but he had an unfortunate experience there, running up against the vastly greater depth and expertise of his British peers. The head of the Navy at the time, the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Ernest J. King, was, on the one hand, as I say in the book, the United States Navy was both blessed and cursed by the leadership of Ernie King throughout World War II. Blessed in the sense that there was no better or more experienced naval strategist in the world than Ernie King. He masterminded the entire Pacific War from start to finish, before Pearl Harbor, right through the Japanese surrender, and it was really quite a masterful strategic performance. On the cursed end of the scale, Ernie King was probably one of the worst human beings that you'd ever want to encounter. Petty beyond belief, difficult for the fun of it, disruptive, egotistical, vain, demanding, irascible, and I could go on, but I think the best way to sum it up is a diary entry that Dwight D. Eisenhower made right at about the time of the Casablanca conference about Ernest King. He said, maybe the best way for us to win this war would be to get somebody to shoot King. So that gives you some sense of who you're dealing with there. And on top of that, he was a dyed-in-the-wool Anglophobe, could not stand the British. So here's some point of difficulty that had to be overcome. The third and last of the American Chiefs of Staff, General Henry Arnold, the head of the U.S. Army Air Corps, was known as Hap Arnold. And I think, again, if you look at that face, you'll see why that would be the case. A genial, pleasant guy to deal with, but also very tough and very demanding. The Air Force at the time was not a separate service, unlike the Royal Air Force or the German Luftwaffe, but a branch of the Army. So Arnold was not technically a chief of staff, but Marshall effectively made him one by practice. So he had pretty much good control, complete control over the American Air Forces. If anybody had ever questioned Hap Arnold's credentials as a pioneer aviator, he had a drop-dead line. The Wright brothers had taught him to fly. In this machine that you see on the screen, which he described as a bicycle with wings. He was one of the 2 initial aviators in the American Army. Within a year, there were 24, and within a year after that, 18 of those 24 had crashed and died in planes like that. So it took a lot of courage to get up into one of those guys. So now we turn to the British. This is the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Lieutenant General Sir Alan Brooke, who was the Marshall's equivalent as the head of the British Army and also the chairman of the British Chiefs of Staff. So he is the central figure on the British side of the military high command. No armchair general was Alan Brooke. He had masterminded the British retreat at Dunkirk from the middle of northern France to the beach. I think pretty much everyone knows the general story of Dunkirk, where the Germans had pinned them against the sea, the British Expeditionary Force of well over 300,000 men, but nobody talks much about how they got there. They weren't on the beach when it started. They were in the middle of northern France. And the Germans, when they invaded France and encircled them, except for pinning them against the sea, vastly outnumbered them, vastly superior weapons, leadership, training, all the rest, by far the best army in the world. And they had to fight their way 40 miles from the middle of northern France to Dunkirk in order to be evacuated. And it was Brooke who led that successful campaign and earned the respect and admiration of everybody involved. A difficult man. I think he's probably the most interesting character on the scene. Brilliant guy, spoke 4 languages fluently other than English, had been brought up in southern France, so knew French before he spoke English, had studied military strategy up and down and back again for decades, and was probably one of the world's great military strategists. That all aside, though, he had another side to him. This is a cartoon that he drew for his children, which he would do in his spare time. He was really quite a talented sketch artist. He would sit at conferences and sketch everybody around the table, and wrote beautifully illustrated letters to his mother. He was also a world-class ornithologist, a pioneer bird photographer. So a very sensitive guy on that side of his life, very interesting mix of that kind of thing with this hard-nosed military tough guy act that carried him to where he got to be. Here he is on the deck of a British destroyer with Churchill, with whom he had a tempestuous relationship, let's say that. 2 alpha males, very dominating, stubborn, difficult, authoritative characters, used to getting their way, not accustomed to being told they were wrong. And they would meet, the British Chiefs of Staff met with Churchill 6 days a week, sometimes twice a day. And the feature bout of those meetings was typically Brooke versus Churchill, where they would argue about military strategy, about tactics and such. And they would eventually resolve those differences and then go to the Americans united, all on the same page, all behind the same plan. FDR paid very little attention to his chiefs of staff, never met with them as a group, rarely met with individuals. At one point, Marshall said to Brooke at Casablanca that 6 weeks might go by before he saw the president. And Brooke replied that he was fortunate if 6 hours went by before he saw Churchill. So there was a different dynamic going on here. This particular photograph was taken a few days after the invasion of France in June of '44. Churchill had insisted at the beginning on going with the invasion force across the channel in the lead ship personally. And nobody could talk him out of it except the king. He got a letter from the king's secretary a couple of days before the invasion began that said His Majesty's anxieties would be substantially increased on D-Day if he knew that his prime minister was on the bottom of the English Channel. That's the only thing that dissuaded Churchill from going. Here we have the equivalent of Admiral King on the British side, the British First Lord of the Admiralty, Admiral Sir Dudley Hickman Rogers Pound. Most of these Brits have 4 or 5 names. They're all aristocrats, almost all of them. Pound was not at the highest level of British society, but he was the son of a barrister. His mother was actually a Bostonian who came from a long line of seafarers. So he's got the mixed blood there, as did Churchill. Churchill's mother was American as well. He's very close to Churchill, very highly regarded, had joined the Royal Navy as a midshipman at the age of 13 and had been in the Royal Navy since 1880. So here we have a guy who knew something about the Navy, about which one of the Americans said he had very favorable opinions. Here he is on the bridge of one of his ships. It was said by one of his rivals that Dudley Pound feared neither man nor God nor Winston Churchill. Lastly, among the 3 British Chiefs of Staff is the commander of the Royal Air Force, the RAF, Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles, several names in between, Portal. I don't always retain the names in between. Charles Portal was a true aristocrat, brought up in a grand English manor house, educated at Winchester and Oxford, and had joined the Army in the second day of World War I as a humble motorcycle dispatch rider and been blown through a door by a shell that killed 5 men on his first week in service. Shortly after that, with the infant Royal Air Force gearing up, he switched over to the Air Force. And again, to give you, similar to Churchill being in the last cavalry charge in British history, when Portal fought as a pilot in World War I, he would shoot at German pilots with a pistol from his cockpit, open cockpit. So again, a huge difference in military technology and the general strategic sense of things in the lifetimes of these men. Here he is with a group of ordinary RAF pilots during the Battle of Britain. And some of you actually were probably a bit older than some of these guys, 19, 20 years old, most of them. You can see how young they are. In 1940, people looked a little older than they do today at their age, but these were kids. And there were only less than 3,000 of them who held off the entire German military for 6 months or so in the Battle of Britain and preserved the British from German invasion. There was a 4th chief of staff, kind of a quasi-chief of staff, Lord, let me see if I get this right, Lord Louis Francis Albert Victor Nicholas Mountbatten, who some of you may have heard of. Quite a character, very flamboyant, humorous, likable guy. The Americans really liked Mountbatten. Everybody liked Mountbatten. He just had that kind of sunny personality, very much against class distinctions. There's a picture of him as an infant in the lap of his grandmother, who was Queen Victoria. He's a cousin of the king. You couldn't get higher up the British aristocracy than Lord Lewis, as the Americans like to call him, but a very down-to-earth guy, very enjoyable company, and the Americans thought very highly of him. He was in charge of combined operations on the British side. That's why there's a separate spot for him. Military, Navy, RAF, all combined in some operation. He was in charge of that sort of thing. So now we come to the site of the Casablanca Conference. This is the Anfa Hotel in a suburb of Casablanca, actually on the outskirts of the city itself, but similar to a suburb. Very wealthy enclave. You can see this sort of 1930s architecture here called Streamline Modern. Kind of looks like a ferry boat at sea. The conference was held on the ground floor where that bow window is at the bottom. And the Americans had commandeered the hotel when they took Morocco a few months earlier, and used it as, Patton used it as his headquarters. Patton had been in command of the Anglo-American force that took Morocco and used the hotel as his headquarters. It was vacated for the conference. The meetings took place, as I pointed out there. The officers all stayed there, and it was not just a minor point that this occurred. There had been two conferences before, one in Washington and one in Quebec by the Anglo-American High Command. And the problem was that, you know, when the meetings were over, the home team would go back to their homes or their offices, and the visitors would go back to their hotels. And after the business was done, they really didn't have much of any interaction. At Casablanca, they were there for 10 days, lived in the same hotel, ate together in the restaurant Panoramique at the top of the building. Went to the bar together, sat around each other's rooms like, you know, freshmen in college, getting to know each other, liking each other, getting a sense of each other as people rather than simply as military colleagues. So that was an important element of forming this special Anglo-American relationship that really pretty much began at Casablanca. Here's an aerial shot of the hotel, and around it you can see 4 or 5 of these very luxurious villas that were owned by wealthy Moroccans and Europeans, and the Americans took all of those as well. The owners were temporarily, you know, commandeered them for the use of the conference, politely, I'm sure, although not without a scene, I suspect, occasionally, and moved them into a hotel downtown. And the villas were then occupied in part by Churchill. You can see Churchill's up at about 1 o'clock, that white building with the terraces to the right of it, and FDR's is over on the right corner there beneath it. So they were within walking distance. And the meetings were held by the military officers separate from FDR and Churchill's meetings. The military officers were hashing out strategy, military strategy, when or while FDR and Churchill were meeting separately, talking about military affairs, but also political affairs, international relations, how to deal with the Russians, how to deal with the French, entertaining each other. You know, they were good friends. They became closer friends in the 10 days that this conference took. And then in addition to all of that, there were 3 plenary meetings, as they called them, where FDR and Churchill met with their high command together on 3 different days spaced out throughout the conference. And at those meetings, which are really quite interesting, there was no holds barred and no respect for rank as to what the right idea was, what a bad idea was, you know, what would work, what wouldn't work. And it's really an interesting dynamic. There are not transcripts, verbatim transcripts of these meetings, but there are minutes that are very complete and detailed. There's 700 pages of minutes from all of these meetings. So we know what was said, who said it, the tone of the conversation, a lot of tension, some bad blood occasionally, some joking, typical big meeting between big, powerful people with a lot at stake. And finally on this is a chart I found in the papers of one of the younger officers at the conference, which gives you a plot plan of the whole area. You can see the hotel in the middle and those villas all around it. And you can also see in red that they ran a mile of barbed wire around the whole thing. And it was surrounded by anti-aircraft guns and tanks. There were fighter planes circling overhead day and night, and it was really quite the military fortress. It was unmistakable that something big was happening there, but nobody really knew what. At one point, the Germans were desperately trying to find out what was happening there. They really couldn't crack through it, but a Spanish spy in the employ of the Germans did get inside information from some source and figured out that FDR and Churchill were meeting with their high command in that spot. Casablanca had been bombed by the Germans 2 weeks earlier. So if the Germans knew they were there, they could have decapitated the entire Allied leadership in 10 minutes had they known this was going on. The Spanish spy wrote a dispatch to Berlin in Spanish that said Churchill and FDR and their high command are meeting in Casablanca. Some poor German officer on the receiving end of this translated Casablanca as White House. So the Germans thought they were meeting in Washington. I don't know what became of the officer, but had it been translated properly, the world would have been a different place. Here is Patton in the backseat of FDR's Jeep, being driven around with the president to a military review. Patton's diary is quite interesting as well. But Patton was not in the meetings, but his typically acerbic comments about the people who dined with him at his villa, and he knew them all anyway, add a little bit of color and often humor. This is FDR's villa at Casablanca, which Churchill immediately dubbed the White House, and everybody else called it the White House after that as well. You see, it's really quite pleasant, nice rich man's villa that FDR stayed in for his 10 days. And here you see on the patio of the villa, FDR there on the right. Next to him is an old friend who was a reserve Army officer, had been a reporter who had covered FDR and a friend of FDR's. And then over at the head of the table, if you will, is Franklin Roosevelt Jr., who was a naval officer in his early 20s, had been decorated in the battle that took Casablanca a couple of months earlier, saving the life of one of his men on the destroyer that he was the executive officer on. Next to Franklin Jr. on his right is FDR's right-hand man, Harry Hopkins, who held no office but was basically FDR's alter ego, the guy that he relied on for judgment and advice and managing things and doing some dirty work now and then when it had to be done. By dirty work, I don't mean corrupt. I mean like firing people and things that FDR didn't want to do. And then to his right is another of FDR's sons, Elliott Roosevelt, who was also in Algeria as a Army reconnaissance pilot, flying low over German positions and photographing them, a dangerous occupation. So I show you for a couple of reasons. One, I think it shows this kind of relaxed, pleasant environment that prevailed here outside the meeting rooms, almost a combination of a conference and a cruise, as somebody has said. But also because it tells you, I think, a lot about how this country approached the war in sending their sons and daughters sometimes to that war at all levels of society, rich, poor, powerful, weak, cities, country, farm, whatever. This was a national effort that everybody had skin in this game and pulling together as a country in a way that I'm afraid some of you college students maybe have never seen in this country, and something that I hope we can get back to someday. Here is another one of the major British players at the conference, Harold Macmillan, who later became the Prime Minister of Great Britain and served actually at the same time as Eisenhower was president of the United States and de Gaulle was president of France. And we'll get to de Gaulle in a minute. But Macmillan at this point was a young diplomat, relatively young, and was there to help handle the French, another big assignment. And very witty guy, interesting, entertaining guy. The scion or a scion of the Macmillan Publishing Company, his grandfather had founded, and an Eton graduate, Oxford graduate, all that, with a really good sense of humor. At one point, he writes a letter back to his wife talking about being escorted to FDR's villa to meet with the president at night. And as he says in the letter, when you go up to the villa at night, a searchlight is thrown upon you, and men wielding the most terrifying weapons you've ever seen cover you until you've shown yourself and they know who you are, and then everything's fine. He's talking about the Secret Service, and he describes the Secret Service as looking like a group of retired Chicago gangsters, which I thought was a little harsh until I found this photograph of FDR's Secret Service detail at Casablanca. So I think Macmillan can be forgiven for coming up with that analogy. Here, just in passing, is there were many, many officers at these meetings, not just the high command we talked about. This is General Ira Aker, who was in command of the American 8th Air Force in Britain, which was the American bomber force that had not yet dropped a single bomb on Germany, by the way, in January of 1943. And no American soldier had fired a single shot in Europe in 1943. We're still fighting Japan at this point and not really in the European war to any great extent. It was Ira Aker, who was the son of a Texas sharecropper, who was ordered to meet with Churchill and try to convince him that he should endorse the American bombing strategy or tactic, which was of daylight bombing. The American bombers were built for daylight bombing. They were heavily armed, heavily armored, and had a very good bomb sight that would allow them to bomb with something close to accuracy from a high place, whereas the British were bombing only at night because they didn't have those kinds of aircraft. They didn't have the heavily armored and armed bombers the Americans had, didn't have the bomb sight, and would only bomb German industrial areas at night. And Churchill wanted the Americans to join them in doing that. He didn't like this daylight bombing business and thought it was too dangerous. There were going to be too many casualties. So Aker was sent over to Churchill's villa to talk him into endorsing this day-night thing. So son of a Texas sharecropper up against Winston Churchill one-on-one, and he had prepared a little memo to convince him of why this should be, one of the points of which was that if we bomb them by day and you bomb them by night, they'll get no break. They'll be up all the time. They'll be either awake or unable to sleep and around the clock, and we'll just wear them down day and night. And Churchill replied, after thinking it through, took the cigar out of his mouth and said, "I like it, General. The devils will get no rest." And that's where that title of the book comes from. So here's a photograph of the actual conferees sitting around their conference table. The Americans are on the left, the British on the right, and you can see among the six that we've talked about, and Mountbatten up in the right corner, there are other officers as well. Two of them, fourth and fifth ones in on the left, were brigadier generals, the lowest ranking general, who were there to take notes and prepare the minutes. So this is a level of a conference where brigadier generals are the note takers, one American and one British. In addition to that, the high command here expected the minutes of their meetings to be on their desks, or rather in front of them at this table, first thing the next morning. So they were up almost all night preparing the minutes while everybody else was sleeping and relaxing. So it was a difficult job. The British note taker up there, fifth one in, name of Vivian Dykes, wrote a little ditty about this that I think is entertaining. He says, and so when the great ones repair to their dinner, the secretary stays, getting thinner and thinner, racking his brain to record and report what he thinks they will think they ought to have thought. There were many issues that had to be decided in these 10 days, but the two most important ones, the overhanging critical ones, were, number one, how much of our resources are we going to put in the Pacific theater and how much in the European theater? At the time, something on the level of about 10% of all the military manpower, shipping and aircraft and such was in the Pacific. 90% was going to be in Europe, or either was already or was going to be, or in North Africa on the doorstep of Europe. And the Americans wanted very much to fight an aggressive war against Japan and defeat Japan as quickly as possible. The American people were far more hostile to Japan than they were to Germany, keeping in mind that at this time, nobody knew about the Holocaust. I mean, they knew that Germans were anti-Semites. They knew that they were doing terrible things, but nobody knew that 8 million people were being killed. And there just wasn't this kind of hostility to the Germans that there was to the Japanese, because the Japanese attacked us, and the Americans weren't keen on that. So the American people very much wanted to prioritize the Japanese war. The British, 20 miles away from occupied Europe, were very much in the other camp. They wanted to fight a purely defensive war in the Pacific and the offensive war in Europe, and put the lion's share by far of assets into Europe, not in the Pacific. So that's the big dispute, number one. We'll go back to the maps to point something out on number two. The second big issue was whether to cross the English Channel and invade northern France later in 1943, or to defer that a year and a half to the spring of 1944. And meanwhile, to use that big Anglo-American army that's in North Africa in the Mediterranean to attack either Sardinia or Sicily or Italy proper or maybe Greece or any of those other occupied areas. And the theory was, behind the British strategy, which is what that was that, first of all, we weren't strong enough to cross the channel successfully yet. Anybody who ever saw Saving Private Ryan knows what it was like to cross that beach in June of 44. We're talking January of 43, when there wasn't anything like the American force yet in Europe that there would later be, and the Germans weren't anywhere near as depleted by casualties and such as they would be a year and a half later. So the British had to convince the Americans that it would be suicidal to cross the English Channel, in 1943 before they were ready. And what they had to do, in the British view, was to work up first through the Mediterranean. As General Brooke described it, think of it as like 5 fingers going down into the Mediterranean. A lot of dispersed territory, a lot of stretched out territory, and the Germans would know that they were coming somewhere because they'd see the landing craft and the preparations in North Africa, but they wouldn't know where. They wouldn't know where they were going to attack. So the Anglo-Americans could pick the weakest spot, hit the Germans there, take that spot, establish a beachhead, a base for the next round, and then do that again, and gradually work their way up through Italy and drain German power, cause a lot of German casualties, pull Germans away from Russia, which was crucial, from the Russian front to keep the Russians in the war. And after a year and a half of that depletion of the enemy, there would also be a huge upswing in the American presence. Shipping, trained troops, weapons, bombers, all of that was yet to come. There wasn't anything like the enormous military power that the Americans were able to bring to bear later. So those were the two big issues. And in brief, the resolution of those issues was a compromise, as all good disputes ought to be settled by compromise, something that has been forgotten in Washington in certain quarters. But the compromise was that the Americans would get about 15% rather than 10% in the Pacific of all these resources, but they would have a free hand with all those resources to fight as aggressively as they could and as they wanted to against the Japanese, rather than a purely defensive holding action until the Germans were beaten. And on the European side, the compromise was that the British committed to cross the Channel in the spring of '44, and in the meantime, the Americans committed to, send as many troops and ships and weapons and such as they could muster to Britain in that year and a half to build up that invasion force so that the attack would succeed. Had it not been for either of those decisions, the war could easily have been lost. This war could have gone either way, certainly at that point. And the men who sat around that table had the enormous burden of making those decisions that were going to win or lose that war. The compromise was brokered by two senior British officers. One is this gentleman here, Field Marshal Sir John Dill, who was the chief of the military liaison in Washington of the British, and had become a good friend of George Marshall. They knew each other, they trusted each other, they went to each other's homes, they were friends, and they trusted each other. So there was a channel there that they could work through. The second, well, here you see Dill with General Brooke. And there's a conversation described in the book that I think matches this photograph perfectly. It may even have been this actual conversation. But, Dill is saying to Brooke, now, Alan, you're not going to get everything you want. We're going to have to give some concessions to the Americans to get this thing done. And, how much are you willing to bend? And Brooke said, not an inch. And Dill replied to that, well, yes, you will, Alan, because if you don't, Winston and Roosevelt will settle this, and you know what a mess they would make of it. So that got Brooke to go along with the compromise plan. Finally, on this subject, this is the architect of that compromise, a British RAF officer by the name of Sir John Coatsworth Slessor, relatively young senior RAF commander who sat at the meetings. He didn't participate. He was a staff officer, but he sat behind them at the kids' table and took notes and watched what people's faces and watched their reactions and got a sense of the room and who was thinking what and where the pressure points might be and where the compromise points might be, and sketched out the arrangement that settled those disputes. One interesting point on Slessor. Those of you who are old enough on this side of the room may remember David Niven. Kind of looks like David Niven, British actor in the old days. But in any event, you can see him leaning on a cane. You see that cane at the bottom of the photograph? That's a statement. Jack Slessor had been lamed in both legs by polio in childhood. And despite that, had been an ace World War I fighter pilot, polio and all, and served his entire career in the Royal Air Force. And he's leaning on that cane as kind of a statement, I think. This is me, and this is what I've done, which I think is an interesting thing. Here is one of those plenary meetings I talked to you about earlier in the dining room of Roosevelt's villa, where FDR and Churchill sitting next to each other at the head of the table, General Brooke to Roosevelt's left, and all the key players standing or sitting around them. And it's at those meetings that they all hash things out together, the politicians as well as the military. While the conference was going on, Roosevelt insisted on reviewing American troops in person, which the commanders were dead set against. First, it would blow the secrecy, obviously, if the President of the United States was there, and who knows, who would have found out about it. And secondly, there was some trepidation among the Secret Service about bringing the President along a review of tens of thousands of men with weapons in their hands, and all it takes is one crazy guy or one disgruntled mental case, and you got a serious problem. But FDR insisted and went and reviewed these tens of thousands of troops, none of whom were expecting him, all of whom were floored when he drove by. And as one of his aides said, at first they were shocked, and then it was really heartening to hear their cheers. He insisted on also writing letters to all the wives and parents, or whatever the case may be, of the soldiers that he either drove his jeep or guarded his villa or served his food or whatever, and also of the military cemetery in Morocco where the soldiers were buried who had been killed in that invasion, about 1,500 American troops. So these letters went out to all these parents and wives, and when I went to Hyde Park, Roosevelt's home and library, to research all of this, there was a file about that thick of letters back to him from all these family members, which are really quite moving and great for the morale of the country as well as the troops. Here he is with Patton and Harry Hopkins at a field kitchen eating out of mess kits. Al fresco, as Patton called it in a letter home. Also during the conference, Roosevelt had a dinner for the Sultan of Morocco, who was the young man sitting on the left on that couch to Roosevelt's right, about 35 years old, I think he was. And his son is standing behind him, the crown prince, who later became the Sultan as well, and other of his high retainers and such. Again, this big conflict between Churchill, the imperialist, and Roosevelt, the anti-colonialist. They were friends. They were both, obviously in a democratic system with the same basic system of government, despite the differences of fighting a common cause against a terrible enemy. But they had very strong political differences and economic and cultural differences. Roosevelt sat next to the Sultan at that dinner and filled his head with the thought that within 5 years, your country will be independent of the French. All these empires are going to be broken up. The French Empire, the British Empire, the Dutch Empire. Everybody's going to get their own country. We're going to send people from MIT to teach you how to build bridges and, roads and all this other stuff, to modernize your economy. And Churchill is sitting there listening to all this. And you can see the face, I think, right there, not pleased, and chomping on his cigar and trying to change the subject, interrupt without success. So it was really another little vignette on the differences between the two. Another quick diversion, coming to the end, but close to the end. I tracked down, there were 5 women at the conference, all of whom were in uniform as Army WACs, as they were called in those days, the Women's Auxiliary Corps. In the 40s, women were not full-blown members of the military equal to the men. They were in a Women's Auxiliary Corps. They had military rank, they had officers, they were uniformed, all of that, but they were not full-blown soldiers the way they are today. I tracked down the daughter of this woman, Captain Louise Anderson. The essence of the story, which takes half a chapter, but I'll give it to you in 2 minutes or one. These 5 women were executive secretaries to Eisenhower and Marshall and the other high commanders. They had been based in London when everybody else was based in London. And when that Anglo-American force took North Africa, Eisenhower moved his headquarters to Algeria. And he wanted his secretaries, and the rest of them did and needed them. So they thought it would be safer to send them on a British troop ship that was going to Algeria rather than to fly them. Well, the troop ship got torpedoed in the middle of the night in the Mediterranean in December. There were not enough lifeboats. 3 of the women got in lifeboats, 2 of them didn't. And as the ship was gradually sinking, a British destroyer happened to come along, came up alongside the sinking ship, and the women were literally thrown from the deck to the British destroyer, and the 3 in the lifeboats made it back as well. But the 5 of them had lost everything they had except the wet clothes on their back, and within a few weeks after that, shipped to Casablanca to serve the purpose I described. It turned out that Captain Anderson here had kept and had given to her daughter her diaries, her memoirs that she wrote that weren't published, interviews that she had done after she got home, and the full story of what I just told you, as well as the story of FDR heard about these 5 women and what had happened to them and invited them for dinner at his villa at Casablanca. So they come over for dinner, half expecting it to be a prank, because they had known Elliot Roosevelt, the president's son, and he said, "Oh, Pop wants to have you for dinner tonight." So they kind of laughed and thought it was a joke, and they were going to find out what it was when they got there. Well, they get there, and there's FDR and his high staff. About 10 minutes later, in walks Churchill and 3 or 4 of the senior British generals. And so these 5 women spent the evening with most of the Allied high command, drinking, eating, having fun, telling jokes and stories. And they give a real personal insight into FDR and Churchill and how they laughed with each other and tried to outdo each other with storytelling and all that. So it's really quite an interesting little vignette. Marshall had heard of it as well, and Marshall said he would arrange to have all their possessions replaced. When he got back home, he was told that wax didn't qualify to have their possessions replaced. So Marshall paid for them himself, bought them, shipped them over, and had them delivered to them. So all of this is written up, and it's, I think, an interesting story. Here the clerical staff is coming out of the Anfa Hotel. The women intermingled with the clerical staff on the men's side. This is a photograph that was among her collection, Captain Anderson, under which she wrote, "Me and a friend." Charles de Gaulle. We don't have time for Charles de Gaulle. If we had the rest of the day, we wouldn't have time for Charles de Gaulle, but I will make it very short and succinct. De Gaulle was a French general who refused to surrender to the Germans when they overran France, and instead hopped on a little plane and flew to London, was flown to London. And Churchill embraced him as kind of the voice of the French resistance that was still fighting the Germans in France, and also of some few thousand French troops and a few ships that had been evacuated at Dunkirk. And Churchill gave de Gaulle a BBC microphone and a good deal of money to support his operation, and he became a kind of heroic figure for the French people, encouraging the resistance. 6'4", all these guys with 5 stars on their shoulders have huge egos. They seem like lambs in the field compared to Charles de Gaulle, probably the biggest ego that it's possible for a human being to have. First of all, he refused to come to Casablanca because he was not going to meet with les Anglo-Saxons, he called them, on French territory occupied by American troops. So they had to almost break his arm to get him to come. Churchill threatened to cut him off if he didn't come. So he finally did come, but the big controversy there was his rivalry with another French general by the name of Henri Giraud, who you see here on the left in German captivity in a castle prison in Bavaria. He was captured by the Germans in 1940. He was 64 years old, and after planning it out for several months, rappelled down the side of the wall of this castle with twisted bed sheets and ropes and wires and things in a downpour at night, and then made his way from Bavaria back to France, totally on his own, by wit and resourcefulness, and became a national hero as a result of that. He was kind of a mainstream French general, and after the Americans and the British had taken North Africa, the French in North Africa threw in with the Allies after a few days of fighting. And the idea was to try to get these 2 French generals to combine in one organization so they wouldn't be at each other and rivals and making redundancies and difficulties. Giraud here was perfectly willing to do that. De Gaulle was not. And it took them 3 or 4 days of hammering to find out that there was not going to be any resolution of this dispute. So what FDR did, I told you earlier about how clever he was and how politically astute he was. He had Giraud and de Gaulle in his villa one afternoon, and unbeknownst to them, the conference was ending. And unbeknownst to them, there were 25 war correspondents on the back lawn waiting for whatever it was, that they were going to be told. They didn't know who was there, why they were there. It was all top secret. And FDR wanted the public to have the impression that these two French rivals had made up and were going to be unified and fight together. They were both very famous at the time, and everybody's kind of waiting to see what would come of this. So here they are sitting on the back lawn of the FDR villa with the two French generals. And FDR, well, first of all, the war correspondents were astounded when they all came out. They had no idea who they were going to see. And before they came out, FDR looked through that window behind him and spotted an AP photographer that had worked in the White House when he was, before the war. And Roosevelt asked Harry Hopkins, his aide, to go out and whisper in the ear of this AP photographer, whose name was Sammy Schulman, and plant a thought in Sammy's head. So when the four of them come out here on the back lawn, the flash bulbs are all flashing and such, and Sammy Schulman raises his hand and says, as if it was his idea, Mr. President, can we get a picture of the two French generals shaking hands? And FDR puts his left hand under de Gaulle's arm and his right hand under Giraud's arm, and they really have no choice but to stand up and as far apart from each other as the laws of physics allowed, and make the quickest handshake in history. But it was enough to make the front page of every newspaper in Britain and America. And the headlines were French unity. So this is an example of FDR's cleverness. This is a shot of that press conference with all those war correspondents in uniform, by the way. They were all sworn in as officers, so they'd be subject to military orders. And there was nothing like a free press in the war in those days. It was all censored and very carefully controlled. Captain Anderson, by the way, is sitting up in the middle at the top with her steno machine, which her daughter also still has, and sent me the original transcript, the verbatim transcript, which may not surprise you to learn that it wasn't exactly the same as the official transcript for a lot of colorful reasons. So that was very helpful. So now we do come to the end. After the conference was over, Roosevelt had never been to Morocco. By the way, no president had ever been anywhere outside the United States during a war, and no president had ever flown anywhere. Roosevelt was flown on a 5-leg trip from Washington to Miami to Puerto Rico to Brazil, across to Western Africa, and up to Casablanca in a wheelchair, 62 years old, not in good health. So that in itself was an achievement. But Churchill loved Marrakech, a couple hundred miles down to the south of Casablanca. He had painted there, very talented amateur painter in the 30s, and loved the place, and persuaded Roosevelt to go down there with him and spend a day just kind of R&R, relaxing and taking in the sun and enjoying Marrakech. Here are the two of them at the top of a minaret at the home that they stayed in, luxurious mansion that they stayed in Marrakech. And Roosevelt did fly home from Marrakech, and Churchill stayed a few more days and had his paint brushes and oils and canvases brought up to the top of this minaret. He had not touched a paintbrush since the war began. This is the only painting he produced in World War II, and that's the painting. The closing story, Churchill had the painting sent to FDR as a gift in the White House. Somehow or other, and I don't know how, I haven't been able to track it down, the painting wound up in the hands of Brad Pitt, who in turn gave it to Angelina Jolie. And when Angelina ended the marriage, she decided she didn't like the painting anymore and put it up for auction, where it sold for $3.5 million. So I'm sure Churchill was twirling in his grave when he heard that news, if he did. That's the presentation. I appreciate your time, and if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
How did they both get there? By ship? Was there airplane? Was it possible to fly on an airplane, or did they take a ship?
Yeah, Roosevelt flew on that five-legged trip from, actually what happened was he had his own armored train, a personal armored train, about 5 cars. And they ran the train from Washington toward Hyde Park, because that's where he would go typically, when he took a break. And then the train turned around in Baltimore and ran back down through Washington to Miami. And then this 5-leg flight in a Pan Am flying boat across the ocean to Africa and Casablanca. Churchill flew from England in a British bomber. There were 2 British bombers that flew him and the military officers to Casablanca. Very uncomfortable. There were 2 cots on these Liberator bombers. Churchill got one and Pound got the other because he was elderly. And the others all had to sleep on the deck, on the floor, on the metal. And in fact, in his diary, Brooke wrote that he slept next to Mountbatten on the cold deck in the back of the plane and did not find him to be a pleasant bed companion, as he put it. He said, I had to establish my rights with my knees and elbows. So it was not a fun trip for either of them. So.
We spoke a lot to the differences in military experience between the two, between Churchill
Can you start
and...
again, please?
You spoke a lot to the differences in military experience between FDR and Churchill. How do you think that difference in experience structured their interactions at Casablanca, and if one was more willing to exert more force than the other?
Yeah, that's a good question. First of all, they had a very genial relationship, the two of them, partly because they genuinely liked each other. At one point, FDR sent a note to Churchill saying he was glad that he was in the same century with him. And they got along very well. They both had a good sense of humor and all of that. But again, they had very different political views, very different levels of military experience than the rest. But Churchill always deferred to FDR he called FDR Mr. President, and FDR called him Winston, which gives you some sense of the positioning. Because although the Brits had been fighting the war almost alone, for all these years and hanging on by their eyelashes, they knew that the Americans were going to be the dominant power within a year or so. And they were going to be calling the shots and fighting most of the battles. So Churchill tended to defer to Roosevelt, but he would nudge him along. He would influence him. He would convince him, to go in a direction that he didn't want to go in. And, FDR admired Churchill and respected him. And so he was influential that way. But in neither side was it a dominant relationship. But FDR always kept a little bit of higher status than Churchill did. Sir?
You mentioned the danger in the location. And I'm just wondering how or why they decided to go there because of that.
Yeah, the question was, it being so dangerous, why did they go there? Why didn't they meet in Washington or London? The main reason was that that vast Anglo-American army was in North Africa, and naval forces were in the Mediterranean. So they could bring in the top commanders, within a half a day. So Eisenhower came in, Patton was there, many others, Montgomery, Alexander, others. So they could quiz them and find out what was happening on the ground, get their input. And it was a daring thing to do, very risky, dangerous thing to do, but that made sense. In the back there? Yes?
Thank you. This is 43, correct?
January, yep.
Okay. 2 years later, there's a re-election and a new vice president. And it's always been talked about how Roosevelt never talked to Truman about a lot of things. He didn't know about the atomic bomb. I have always heard that Roosevelt made a decision that the British and the French should not be allowed to take over their colonies again, the ones that have been conquered by the Germans or by the Japanese. And I'm assuming he probably never communicated that to Truman.
I lost one thing there. You said that he never wanted what to happen?
That he didn't want the imperialists to take back their
empires.
colonies.
Yeah, right.
And I assume he never told that to Truman. And I've often wondered, if Truman had known that, would the French have returned to Indochina? Would there have been a Vietnam War? Or would there have been pressure to let Indochina, in whatever capacity, become independent countries?
Well, General Brooke wrote after the war that once you start going down the path of what would have happened if, you can go in all kinds of directions, so nobody really will ever know. But, the French, as it turned out, the British gave up their empire voluntarily, piecemeal. Well, voluntarily because they really had no alternative, but they didn't have to be, pushed out. There was no wars involved in that. And they gave up gradually in the late 50s and into the early 60s, mid-60s, most, if not all, of their empire. They still have a few islands in the Caribbean and some things, but essentially all of it voluntarily. The French had to be driven out. The French fought the Vietnamese for years, trying to free themselves from French rule. They fought a war in Algeria for several years to drive them out. And again, the personality of Charles de Gaulle, who was in charge in France at the time, he was the least likely guy on the earth, I think, to give up anything to anyone who wasn't French. So who knows what would have happened otherwise, but that's what did happen. Sir.
Thanks. You mentioned Stalin earlier on, and his absence kind of looms large. Were Churchill and FDR checking with him? Were there cables back and forth to see if Uncle Joe is going to agree with our statements that emerge?
There were no communications during the conference, but immediately after the conference, they sent him a report. He was not going to like the news that they weren't going to invade northern France in '43, because he was desperate to get the Germans off of his back. 80% of the German military fought the Russians, not the British or the Americans or the French. And the Russians just barely hung on. And had they not hung on, no way we could have won that war. I mean, they needed us and we needed them. So they kind of sweet-talked Stalin after the meeting and told him why it was good news for him that they were going to go up through the Mediterranean first and draw forces from the Russian front that way. He did not see it that way, but there wasn't a whole lot he could do about it. And then, of course, the later conferences in Yalta and Potsdam, where he was present, that's a whole other story.
Thanks. Yeah, you mentioned the two major points of compromise, the resource allocation between Europe and the Pacific, as well as where to establish the beachhead in Europe. How much of that stuff was baked coming in into the respective plans of the Americans or the British, and was there just speak to that?
Sure. Well, first of all, the British were enormously better prepared than the Americans. The British had prepared beautiful 30-page white papers on every significant issue. They had brought with them a headquarters ship that was in the harbor at Casablanca with electronic equipment so they could communicate instantly with London. They had all the War Office studies and experts on that ship at their disposal. The Americans had none of that. The Americans brought a total of 7 officers to Casablanca, including the 3 chiefs of staff. The British brought 72 and just vastly outnumbered them, outplanned them, far more prepared, better prepared. They had met among themselves for about a month every day to plan this conference. FDR met with his high command for an hour and a half, 2 days before they left. So the comparison was shocking, really. But the the British came in and really much prevailed on all of these points with concessions, that had to be made to make the deal. But the Americans never let that happen again. As Marshall said, we might have been slow, but we were quick enough to pick that up. And at one point, he said after the war, when he was interviewed, We were always very suspicious of the British and didn't fully trust, except for a couple of exceptions that I mentioned, didn't fully trust them, to be straight with us. But the British thought we weren't smart enough to be treacherous. So they really kind of dominated, the British dominated. But in the conferences after that, there were 3 or 4, the Americans outmanned them, outprepared them, came with all kinds of resources and had begun to learn, what it's like to be a world power. It was really that, they were really just that naive. One of the American officers who was there said, all we ever wanted to do was win the war and go home. And the British had other agendas.
Thank you. I'm fascinated to know what your research looked like in, say, tracking down leads, such as with the daughter of the women's auxiliary lady there, and also where a lot of the documents and photographs came from, if you had to do any traveling of any sort to find these things.
Well, I'll start with the second part first. It was high COVID. So much as I had planned and wanted to go to Morocco, my wife didn't think it was a good idea to be in Morocco with COVID. Get hit with that in a foreign country where we didn't speak the language and all that. So we didn't get to go. But I relied on some very good librarians and archivists in England who, I told them what I was looking for and what I needed, and they tracked it down, helped me track it down remotely. Some of it's online. But when it wasn't, they would send me material from there. And I did go to a lot of places here. Many of the archives were closed here, too, in libraries. But again, the ones that were, the archivists and the librarians were helpful because they were still working. But, they would run things down and send me things that way. But I won't go into depth. But the way I generally do it, I always do it, I just start by reading a few secondary sources first. What is this Casablanca conference? What was it all about? Who was there? Why? And, it had been talked about in a chapter of a book somewhere or half a chapter somewhere else. So, there was material about it out there. So I learned that overview. And then I just tracked down through, remote shoe leather in this case. One lead leads to another and one document leads to another. And the libraries all have directories and, what's the word? It's not coming to me. A document that tells you what's in every file and the significance of it and all the rest. So I was able to piece it together that way. Apart from the minutes, which, as I said, were over 700 pages in themselves, all of those war correspondents you saw on the lawn there, we're all taking pictures all the time. On FDR's review of the troops, that was all photographed. There were official photographs of all of them at the conference table and so forth. Those maps and charts, were all available. But to me, that's the fun part. The research is the fun part. The first and second draft is drudgery. There were 12 drafts. But each one gets a little easier than the last one, and that by the time you get to 12 and 13 or whatever, it's kind of fun. It's polishing up. But, it's not as good as watching football, but it keeps me off the street.
I'm just curious, is the resort still around in Casablanca where they had this meeting?
The hotel is gone. The hotel was torn down, I think, in the 80s and replaced by a fancy apartment complex. But the villas are still there. Roosevelt's villa is now the American consulate in Casablanca, and FDR's is privately owned. Just by chance, I started my law career in a big Boston firm, and one of the partners there was James Roosevelt III. He was a grandson of FDR's, and he was helpful. But he also had gone to the 20th year anniversary at Casablanca, where a lot of these people came back. And he had, materials and recollections and stuff from that, so that was fun too.
And then director and writer Christopher Nolan has done a lot of films as of late with Dunkirk and Oppenheimer. Do you feel like those are actually pretty accurate, or have you feel like they're kind of written just to get people in the seats to watch these movies?
Well, I'll tell you what, to go back further to my earlier books, Lincoln, you know, the movie Lincoln, Spielberg's Lincoln, that's a good model for this question. It's a great movie. How many of you have seen the Spielberg Lincoln? If you haven't seen it, you should. It's really good. If you're interested in history at all, it's really quite good. Daniel Day-Lewis plays Lincoln. It's perfect, absolutely perfect. I mean, everything I read about Lincoln, he brought Lincoln to life. That said, just about every other thing in that movie is inaccurate. And I think that's true of almost all these historical movies. The drift of it is right. You know, the general storyline is right. But they go more for the theatrical, dramatic effect of the particulars than the literal accuracy a lot of the time.
One more. One of the early pictures you showed when he was with Harry Hopkins and his sons, it looked like he was wearing a black armband. And I was wondering who he was memorializing.
Yeah, his mother had died. And to tell you how close he was to his mother had died a year and a half before that. So he was still wearing that black armband a year and a half later. By the way, I did an interview recently with a radio discussion with a Canadian author who's done a dual biography of Roosevelt's mother and Churchill's mother. And so they put us together, you know, to talk about things. And both of them, well, obviously, FDR's mother was American and Churchill's mother was American. And they were both born in New York in the same year and in the same high society. She could never track down that they had met, but the odds are very high that they had. So the further back you go, the more depth you can get. In fact, when Churchill spoke at a joint session of Congress, right after Pearl Harbor, came over here first thing to rally, you know, everybody together, and he stood up, you know, with his thumbs in his lapels like he would do in the House of Representatives and said, well, if my father had been American and my mother British, instead of the other way around, maybe I'd have gotten here on my own. Okay, thank you very much.